Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to be talking about summer of 2020 and how group water schemes are going to have to adapt to more drier, warmer summers and the impacts this may have on their operations. So during the course of the presentation, we'll be looking at the weather of 2020, rainfall, temperatures, comparing that with previous years, looking at the usage on group water schemes during these prolonged dry periods, the water levels at source, the water quality, management of the schemes, the use of consumer meters and bulk meters, communication with your members, working together, solutions that came up with, and then lessons learned. So first of all, before we get into it, we might look at extreme weather events and what they have on the impacts they have on group water schemes. So going back to 2010, we had the big freeze. This had a huge impact on group water schemes operations. We had mains, pipes freezing. We had additional bursts. We had meters, consumer meters freezing, people without water, and subsequently bursting as well. There was a huge cost in repair and replacement of such meters. And then people, to prevent the meters and pipes from freezing, would leave taps running, which increased water usage in schemes as well. Moving on to December 2015, we had Storm Desmond, which caused severe flooding in a lot of areas of the country, especially in the west. This had severe complications in getting access to group water scheme sites. It also led to contamination of a lot of group water scheme sources as well. Moving on to October 2017, we had Storm Ophelia, which caused high winds, damage to power lines, trees fell down, taking power lines down and causing power outages. We also had some minor damage to treatment plants from these high winds. March 2018, then we had Storm Emma, which caused huge snow drifts and snowfall around the country, which meant that it was difficult to get to group water scheme treatment plant sites that are mainly remote rural areas that wouldn't be well-travelled roads, or wouldn't be roads that are going to be cleared or gritted by the local authorities. So we had schemes that were unable to get chemicals delivered to treatment plants, we had other schemes that were unable to get sludge collected, and had a huge knock-on effect on operations. Then we had 2018, later that year, we had the heat wave, which caused huge issues for water levels at source. We had demand increases from group water scheme members, and this is obviously very similar to 2020. Later that year, we had Storm Ali, again causing high winds, damage to power lines, and flooded areas again within the country. And so looking at 2018, it's very similar to 2020 in that we had the hot weather earlier in the year, followed by a storm later in the year. So just looking at the rainfall from 2017 to 2020, you can see that during 2020 we had very low rainfall from May. 2018, we had very low rainfall from May until October. It started to increase then in November. If you look at 2020, you can see that again, we had very low rainfall from March right up until June, and only after June, July, we saw things kind of starting to increase. If you look at other years, you'll see that these low rainfall lasted for a month at the most, but then spiked up very early afterwards. That kind of gave sources and water levels a chance to recover a lot quicker. Looking at the temperature then from 2017 to 2020, you can see again these levels. 2018 started off as kind of a cooler year, but then got very hot during the summer months. 2020, I should say, then wasn't as cool, but again got warmer a bit quicker. And this obviously with the low rainfall had a serious impact on group water scheme sources earlier than the 2018. So we'll compare 2018 and 2020, and you can see then that obviously we had drier weather earlier in the year, not for the same length of time, but that with a warmer spell early in the year caused these problems to develop on group water schemes. Thankfully, it didn't last as long as 2018, but long enough to cause problems for group water scheme members. So looking at usage on group water schemes, and generally usage can be fairly consistent on schemes. So you can see here in 2017 and 2016 that the curves generally follow the same pattern. You've got your seasonal changes from spring to summer, peaks in summer, levels off then later on in summer, and again a gradual increase later in the year when cattle start to go back into sheds, and you've got that winter seasonal variation. When we look at other years on top of that, the blue line is 2018, and you can see here that the usage on these same schemes, 18 schemes in Limerick, spiked well over the maximum ever experienced before. And this was during June, July, and August, those months where it was very warm, very dry, and didn't really get back in line with previous years until basically November of that year. So usage was above the normal and well above the normal from May until October. One of the main things from this slide is when we look at 2020, we can see that although the weather was warm and dry early on, the usage didn't spike to the same levels that it did in previous years. This goes to show that schemes were well more prepared for these prolonged dry periods, with working with their members and working with their other organisations. They got ahead of the curve, if you like, and then they got this problem addressed way sooner, that we didn't see the same spikes. So it goes to show that it is possible to prepare for it. So when did these issues arise in 2020? So when we look at the rainfall versus the temperature, we can see here in March, April, very low levels of rainfall, temperature starting to go up. And then come the latter half of May, we can see that we would have been in contact with our group water schemes from April to May, knowing that things were a lot different than previous years. During May, we got 5 schemes that started to experience issues where demand and supply were very close together. Following week, that jumped to 11. And then weeks later, it went to 22 and 23. During the course of these times, then things were put in place, solutions were put in place. We were working with the group water schemes, the local authorities were working with group water schemes, and some of these schemes were actually getting solutions quicker than the others were coming online with problems. So not all 23 schemes were having issues at the same time. And I suppose the tracker will give us a better indication of this. So we can see the 22nd week of the year, issues start to arise. Following week, this figure jumped to 11. And the week 24, we saw one scheme in the action category where it had to actually do serious, address the problem with serious issues, had to go and look at additional sources or investment in other solutions. Thankfully, only 3 group water schemes ever fell into this category. A lot of group water schemes, up to 20 group water schemes on the watch list, where supply and demand were very, very close. Things start to improve then on some of these schemes on the 26th week of the year. So in the middle of June, we start to see a little bit of improvement. And this is where sources start to the pressure start to come off, usage start to come down, sources start to get a chance to recover. And as you can see then, come the 28th week of the year, we start to see schemes come into the resolve category, and up to the 31st week of the year, majority of schemes had moved out of action, very little on the watch list, 3 on the improved list, and 17 schemes were resolved. Thankfully today, nearly all schemes have gone into the resolve list, and the last 2 schemes are basically in the process of developing additional sources for future events. Looking at the well level data, so this is a group water scheme in Limerick, Griston group water scheme, and I just basically looked at their average monthly well levels from 18 to 2020. So you can see here that again, very similar to what we're talking about earlier on, come June of 2018, the well levels dropped below 26 metres above the level of the pump, and it stayed that way until basically November. So very similar to the rainfall. In 2019, you can see there's only 1 month really that it came very, very low, 2 months below the 26 metres, and then start to gradually increase very soon after that. If we look at that in 2020, then you can see that the levels start to drop a lot earlier and stayed down until July, and thankfully have recovered since then. So we can see that this scheme source is fairly responsive to rainfall, and has that impact after a few weeks or days of heavy rainfall or higher rainfall. This levels start to increase on this spring, similar to a lot of springs around the country. So it just shows the impact that the rainfall and temperature has on water levels. So if we wanted to compare 2020 and 2018, what we would see is that in 2018, all group water schemes experienced an issue in demand during the months of May until August. 32 group water schemes were affected from 13 counties. In 2020, all group water schemes experienced an increase in demand during the months of April until June. And then we had 23 group water schemes from 12 counties experiencing issues. So we also had wells, individual wells. So consumers or members around the country with individual wells had these issues as well. And where their wells tend to not be as deep as group water scheme wells and can be affected a little bit quicker. We had schemes experiencing a lot of applications for water connections from individual private wells. Normally what you would see is that the well levels go low, but also then the water quality gets deteriorated and issues start arising, and then they look for an alternative supply. We do have, where there is no group water scheme or an Irish water supply in place, the department have made funding available for schemes to come together, apply for funding to lay a new water main and connect into either a group water scheme or Irish water supply. And a number of these projects have got off the ground over the last number of years. A lot of these wells were impacted in 2018 and have made changes or addressed these issues. And thankfully, we didn't have the same number of individual wells being affected in 2020. So water quality was also affected from prolonged dry periods. So what we saw on a number of schemes is colour and turbidity increasing. On surface water sources, we noticed an increase in algae blooms. Nitrates and groundwater schemes tended to go up after the very dry period. And in Cavan Monaghan, we saw an increase in manganese in raw water. Again, bacteriological contamination tends to go up because you tend to be pulling water in from a wider area. Photograph here is back in 2018, where Clifton Group Water Scheme extended their intake from their well to get better raw water quality being brought into their treatment plant. So just looking at the usage in group water schemes again, so this is a group water scheme in Galway, 300 house scheme, very consistent usage. In 2018, they had two kind of spikes. One was in March, the first circle is in March, when the snowfall came, and you can see how that had an impact in overall usage on the scheme. And then the second one is between June, July and August, during that prolonged dry period or the heat wave that we experienced. And you can see that it went up well over the norm, and that spikes then would be well in excess of 30%, even 40% of their normal daily usage. So when we look at this scheme then for 2020, you can see that very similar pattern from April, May and June of 2020. Very same thing, usage gone up, the same percentages of an increase, and you can see again that their normal usage is very consistent, very steady, and the main impact was due to these dry periods. So where is this demand coming from? Well, obviously we have agriculture. Animals, as we all know, drink an awful lot more water in dry, warm weather, can basically have a huge impact on overall usage. We do have farmers using water for irrigation purposes, for spraying crops, and for also agitating slurry. But by no doubt, the biggest consumers of water are humans, and we all are prone to, when we get the fine weather, making the most of it. So in almost every garden around the country, we had paddling pools out for kids. We had hose pipes out for watering gardens, washing cars. And because of the lockdown this year, we tend to have a lot more people at home and a lot more people able to spend time in the garden, preparing their houses for painting and power hosing for painting, and just general use of water shot up very early on in the year. Just to give an example of this, this is a slide from Michael O'Leary of Irish Water, looking at Irish Water's usage, and you can see the red dots are warm, dry days. The blue dots are more cooler, overcast days, and the impacts that this has on daily usage on their supplies. One thing to note is this pink block here is when the hosepipe ban came into place, and you can see that the impact this had on overall usage by members of our consumers of Irish Water. And indirectly, this had an effect on group water schemes, because when the hosepipe ban came into place, a lot of consumers of group water schemes adhered to it, even though it wasn't issued for them, and it did play a part in getting usage down on group water scheme side of things as well. So communication is key, and it just shows the impact of a dry day versus a dull day, or a cool day versus a warm day is a massive impact on usage around the country. Water management and group water schemes is vital. So most schemes have consumer or bulk meters fitted on their network, and most of them will have telemetry on these bulk meters. What that means then is that these bulk meters can be monitored daily. Night flows and graphs can be produced from them, but it's very easy to compare with previous weeks, previous months, previous years. So when a spike comes or when an increase comes, it's very easy to pinpoint it down to a certain section of your scheme. This is an example of a group water scheme in Offaly, and they have strategically located their bulk meters around their network, divided their network up into different areas. So if a spike comes in any of these, they're able to go directly to that area and do further investigation. Further investigation then may lead to a leak on the network, and if so, then they can see what effects that will have. So this is just a graph of when a leak would have occurred. The nighttime flows are way higher on the scheme. You fix the leak, and then you focus on your usage, and you can see that it drops down a lot lower than previously before. So you can record exactly how much water that leak was wasting on a daily basis. And likewise then, if you go and monitor a certain area and you actually go and read the consumer meters, you might find that the problem is on the consumer side. And that means then that these consumers can be contacted and explain that their usage has gone high, and maybe to rectify any problems or issues they may have to keep water usage down. So without these tools in place, it's almost impossible to find out where water's going and how you're going to address it or solve it. Group schemes then in general would have had huge communications with their members. So this is just a website of one of the group water schemes in Limerick, and it's all kind of water conservation advice. So this can be issued out to schemes by paper or text messages. And if you let them know then that if water is going to be restricted at night time, you can let them know that if they spot a leak or are aware of any leaks, that they can report that to the committee or the board of management, and it can be dealt with fairly quickly. You can also keep them aware of the well levels, how much water is in the wells and how much water is being used by all consumers, so that they will know then that they need to act and help this group scheme out to keep abreast of the problem. The National Federation of Group Water Scheme then developed a water conservation communication strategy, and that was basically draft or templated text messages, press releases, radio campaigns, and newspaper articles that were available to group water schemes around the country, that they could get out there to the members to make sure that this was addressed and that they knew that there was a problem on their scheme. So an example of this was 3 group water schemes in Roscommon came together and issued a joint press release in the local papers, and this paper was covered all the consumers in their 3 schemes. And similarly, 3 group water schemes in Cavan placed a joint radio campaign advert on local radio, and again this radio station would have covered all of their consumer database. So it shows exactly how schemes can work together to solve a problem or address an issue. The Federation also developed a water conservation video, and this is basically advising members of group water schemes how they can reduce their usage and be aware of what they are using and the impacts it can have on their group water scheme overall demand. And this is available on our website. We've also developed a water calculator for, again, members of group water schemes, where they can go in, put in all the data about their usage in their households on a weekly basis, and this will calculate their annual usage and show them how much above or below the national average they are. And again, both of these are available on our website. Details are below. So working together, the Federation, Irish Water and the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government worked closely together in both years, in 2018 and 2020. The department committed to giving any assistance that's needed for group water schemes that were in serious trouble. This would involve developing maybe new sources, bringing backup supplies into production, temporary connections with neighbouring schemes, temporary connections with Irish Water. And I suppose this worked both ways as well, where Irish Water could tap into some group water scheme supplies if they needed to do so. Other solutions then for group water schemes: nighttime flow reduction. So during when water would be at its lowest usage, that you would shut off the supply, and then if there was any leaks in the network or even on the consumer side, at least that wasn't been used up during the course of the night. Pressure reducer valves were installed on group water schemes. Um, and where they were in place were great tools to reduce flows and pressures to various areas. As I mentioned earlier on, backup sources were brought into service where available. One of the big things here was to make sure that the water quality was sufficient and treatment was sufficient to cater for the needs. And new sources were and are being developed where necessary. And again, these are all done in consultation with consultant hydrogeologists before they would go for funding for the department. Lessons learned, I suppose, impacts are very much scheme specific. So you can see that schemes that are vulnerable to rainfall, they tend to be ones that might go low quicker, but will respond quicker after heavy rainfall. Both surface water and groundwater sources were affected. There's no doubt that consumer metering is essential and bulk metering is essential to quantify where water is going and act on where the water has been used. Communication is vital, as we mentioned earlier on. You can see it from the hose pipe ban, but you can see it from the Limerick schemes where they would have sent out text messages to members in 2020 and they didn't see the same spikes as in 2018. Design of the treatment plant and your storage capacity and your source are all going to have impacts as well, because there's only so much water you can get out, there's only so much water you can put through a treatment plant, and then storage tanks are designed for a certain amount of water as well. So all of these things have impacts on water supply to your members. Lessons learned, I suppose, group water schemes that were less affected had more resilient sources and better understanding of the impact of extreme weather events on their source, and this is due to the installation of well-level sensors and monitors that are able to build up that trend over time. An example of this was Tipperary County Council, where they have installed well-level sensors on all group water schemes across the county, and these schemes now have a great idea of how dry weather and prolonged dry spells impact on the water, amount of water and water levels available in their sources. Reduced and accounted for water definitely had an impact, so where schemes were able to keep on top of wastage on both consumer side and the network side, they were able to have more water available for actual usage then. Where you have full control over water demand monitoring with your bulk meter monitors and loggers, and also your AMR on your drive-by system for your consumer meters. And pressure, I suppose pressure is one thing that we can take for granted. A lot of people think the more pressure the better, but in fact the less pressure probably the better, because you're not feeding the same amount of water through leaks or wastage on the consumer side. So that's the end of the presentation. Just thank you for listening. Hopefully you've taken something from it, but if you have any questions, feel free to contact me on the website or in the question and answer session afterwards.